Okay, so this morning we're going to share. This all started because of a conversation that I had with Connor and Vinny were over there, and they were in the middle of reading a book about World War II, and I'm not sure what the book was, but anyway, the conversation I told them about Arnold Schumacher here, who is been a member of our church for a couple of years now, and he had quite some interesting experiences. Arnold was born and raised in Germany, and I'm just going to turn this over to him and let him tell you his story, because it's really a interesting, amazing story. So thank you, Arnold, for being with us.
Thank you for the fine introduction. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I have a talk for you that I'm going to read because it's a story with twists and turns. And I gave it to the Blithe Spirits in March, and somehow word got around. So you people are the second to get this story. I hope you can hear all right. Next February, I will celebrate my 67th anniversary of my arrival in America. I celebrate this anniversary every year because I've never been sorry that I came. Despite all the doom and gloom that we hear in the news nowadays, I believe that America continues to be the greatest country to live in, and we all are blessed to live here. Shall we all say amen?
Amen.
By contrast, where I came from 67 years ago was very different, and how I came here may make an interesting story for you. It won't be all funny, but it does have surprises and twists and turns. That's why I'm reading it. To start, born in 1927, my entire youth was spent during the Hitler dictatorship. I call it a youth in Hitler sixes. I was 6 when Hitler came to power. I was 12 when he started World War II. I was 18 when Germany and much of Europe lay in ashes, and he dead by his own hand. Despite countless Hitler speeches, incessant propaganda, and teachers' rants, none of all the Nazi ideas have stuck on me. In fact, very much the opposite. I never lost my love and respect for Germany, my home country. But also I've never lost my shame for how Nazism corrupted my home country and caused worldwide suffering. What happened? In 1934, when I was 7 years old, Hindenburg, the famous World War I general and last president of the Weimar Republic, died. And I listened on the radio to Hindenburg's gigantic state funeral and Hitler's immediate dictatorial assumption of power, and it dawned on me then what an overpowering, menacing state I was living in. Then 2 years later, when I was 9, Hitler remilitarized Western Germany, where we lived. And I remember standing on the sidewalk of a big highway as regiment after regiment of infantry marched past me just 6 feet from the tip of my toes. And I sensed that the army would someday become part of all our lives. I still remember the smell of leather, grease, sweat, and horses. Then, November 1938, At age 11, I watched 2 synagogues burn as part of Kristallnacht, which was a violent anti-Jewish pogrom unleashed by the Nazis. And a scary feeling came over me of some things being done in Germany that were wrong. But I didn't know the whole picture. I, as others, felt locked in. Then in 1939, age 12, I watched my foster mother, who was my aunt, who had spent 4 years as a World War I army nurse, bitterly weep as Hitler attacked Poland. And World War II began, just 20 years after the first one had ended. Then on June 22, 1941, when I was 14, enrolled in a tough boys' school, we all were awakened with a shout, "Germany is marching into Russia." And it dawned on me then what Germany's future and ours and mine might well become. But while the outside world grew ever more threatening, God was holding up my inner life from the beginning and in ever so many wondrous ways. My foster mother, who gave me the best of parental care, gently but firmly nourished my understanding of right and wrong, which was needed in those times, and held up church, God, and faith as something immensely beautiful, strong, and sacred. My first grade teacher taught me the earliest prayers and hymns, and religion was taught in school in Germany, even in Nazi times, in school. And there I had an outstanding teacher, a retired minister for several years. When we boys were 14, our pastor gave us confirmation lessons, as you have them. And I never forgot one question I asked him in class. Why is it that Germany is so hard on the Jewish people? When Jesus was Jewish, and we are supposed to love him. I was 14 years old and wanted an answer. Later I learned that this pastor belonged to the Confessing Church. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, you remember his name. And his sermons, often railing against the evils of the times, also had to be consoling, while mothers in the congregation wept over the ever-increasing casualties. Then March 1942, I was confirmed in the Lutheran faith. It came to stick with me in the ensuing years. I knew hard times and changes were ahead. Could I have a glass of water? So one day in February 1943, our lives were indeed radically changed. Thank you. At mid-morning during class, our school director steps in, gives the Hitler salute, and announces that in 2 weeks, the entire class will report for full-time service in one of the heavy anti-aircraft batteries, Flak as they were called, in Mannheim, a big industrial city near where I lived. Bold out of the blue, but long prepared by the Nazi government. Why this move? We were 15, 16, and some of you older. Total war casualties to date were rising into the millions. Two huge battles, Stalingrad in Russia and El Alamein in Africa, cost 500,000 German lives. So 15 and 16-year-olds now were called up to man the flak batteries under command of regular officers, thus freeing full-age men for the front. This was done in all Western cities, later expanded countrywide. So that was a change for our lives. Our first action was on the 8th day. Then, in many, many nights, over the next 2 years, hundreds and hundreds of heavy British bombers, Lancasters, carpet bombed our city into flames over and over again. And I have a picture of what this looks like. It's from Life magazine. Then by day, American bombers, B-17 and B-24, came for precision bombing of special targets. Altogether, our battery shot some 10,000 rounds into the sky, and as you can figure, what goes up has to come down. Two neighboring batteries suffered direct hits from bombs, each a carnage with some 20 dead. We were lucky, 52 hits in one night, but no losses. That's lucky. I learned handling pressure, nerves, and fatigue from all the night raids. But again, I had help. In my locker, I had my confirmation Bible and read it often for worship and succor. There it is. That's my Bible from the flak days. Then toward the end of the war, everybody ended up in the infantry. Airmen, sailors, gunners, everybody. Planes, ships, tanks, all heavy weapons were either destroyed or so few left they were useless. I remember on one night I marched by a single gun, and when I asked how many shells you got, they said 2. Then on a night in July, we were summoned to join the Nazi Party. Of the 12 in our group, 10 joined, and one other and I refused. At that time, I did not realize what was done by the Nazi government to refusers, but my being in the army shielded me from the hands of the party. So I was lucky again. I was young and ignorant. And 1 week before Christmas 1944, I was ordered to report to an infantry garrison as Allied troops were already entering German territory. The months that followed were the hardest of the war. We wore patched up uniforms with the hated rolled up puttees instead of boots. We had no helmets, a foreign-made rifle with little ammunition, no tanks, no vehicles, no gear. We often ate horse meat and rotten potatoes and countless rutabagas, but I will say they do beat starving. Gun drills, field maneuvers, barricade building formed our days. There were no church services and no liberty given for any. The whole atmosphere was depressed and expecting the end. Only the Nazi propaganda machine ranted on senselessly. But again, God in a particular way looked after my soul. In my pockets, I have there it is. Thank you. In my pocket, I carried a small New Testament. You know, when you're in the infantry, you got to carry everything in your body. So I went from a heavy Bible to a small New Testament. And my Catholic friend Peter and an older Catholic seminarian and I, on off-duty hours, would meet and talk about what was on our hearts. You know, that was meaningful at those times. In March 1945, with the Americans now just 20 miles away, we were ordered to regroup for a major counterattack. There followed weeks of night marches to escape strafing, nights in rain-soaked foxholes and tents, artillery barrages, and mortar fire. The American Army pursued us relentlessly. On one solo patrol, I spotted 36 American armored vehicles and tanks within 1 kilometer. That's only about 2/3 of a mile, facing us. I thank God for some of our courageous commanders who allowed desperate last-minute retreats, defying Hitler's standing orders. Retreating troops sometimes were machine-gunned by SS police units and placed behind them to stiffen resistance. And one of my buddies ended up with 4 bullets, but he did survive. I also remember many humble crucifixes along the wooded trails in the woods. The faithful country people's humble acknowledgments of their Savior's sufferings. It was the Easter season. Then on April 10, 1945, Sherman tanks, 5 Sherman tanks, got us in their crosshairs and let us have it. I was hit by 2 shell fragments in my lung, which also knocked out my right arm. And after a day alone, I dragged myself into a nearby village. At midnight, a Catholic priest took me in. His housekeeper cleaned me up and bandaged me, and next day I was surrendered to the arriving American main force. Their first question was he SS? And luckily, no, I was regular Army. You know the difference between SS and regular. SS were the political troops who did the horrible deeds in the camps. Three dozen Sherman tanks then kept rolling past the little house and made it shake every time. A group of Polish prisoners who had spent the war working on nearby farms begged the American commanders not to destroy the little town where they had been treated well by their German employers, farmers, so there was no more artillery fire. The priest saved my life. I stayed 3 days in his house. After my return home, months later, I wrote him. 13 days later, on my first return to Germany, I visited the little house, but he had been moved, and his replacement, having seen wars end in Yugoslavia, made me shudder with his bloody memories. God again had protected me big time in more than one way. Then followed 3 months in American Army hospitals. The first one near the front had wounded Germans lying next to wounded GIs, and it looked like MASH on TV, only larger and without radar. The next 2 were in Nancy and Le Mans in France. There we learned of the capitulation. and for the first time of the Nazi horrors. We had an awful, awful lot to digest while our bodies recovered. Speaking adequate English, I read army newspapers to my fellow German prisoners and translated some of their medical treatments to them. And I will always sing high praises for the American nurses, doctors, and chaplains who saved countless lives, German as well as American. We prisoners were treated well and appreciated it. Then in July, I was given a set of old army fatigues with large letters, POW, painted on front and back. The jacket had 4 telltale holes, neatly repaired, meaning its owner didn't survive. For medical reasons, I was to be discharged quickly. After 2 weeks in PW camp in Germany, I arrived by truck in my hometown, Heidelberg, after 2.5 years away. Our American driver wistfully grinned as he handed us 40 marks of script money and our discharge papers. We, the beaten, were home. He, the victor, had to wait till he had his 85 service points before he could go home. Going home is the dream of all soldiers. It was a warm, bittersweet, thankful homecoming. Heidelberg and my home were not destroyed. My father in Munich was bombed out 3 times. One of my friends was killed in Russia, his brother in Africa, and a cousin of mine in Germany. The saddest family loss was the mass suicide of my father's sister, her husband, and 16 neighbors after the Russian army had overtaken them in their flight, and they were about to suffer revengeful cruelties from their Russian captors, similar, sadly, as earlier in the war, Russians had suffered at German hands. All 18 lay down face down in the grass, and it fell to my uncle to give them a neck shot, every one of them then one himself. And lastly, my mother's second husband, a Jewish doctor, lost 3 relatives in the concentration camps. Returning soldiers must relearn civilian living. They must locate former buddies, clean up their language, learn regular washing again in the field, often months without any, live on limited calories, and in rooms of 40 degrees Fahrenheit, buy clothes only with government permit and fit into a new post-war world. And after 3 years interruption, we veterans were given token make-up schooling so we could get our high school diploma. The need for living quarters throughout Germany after 2.8 million tons of bombs had been dropped was catastrophic. Soon 11 refugees were assigned to stay for the duration in our small 3-person household. It was hard times, but church again played a role with sermons, concerts, soul care, and memorial services. Churches are always full in hard times. On Sunday, November 4, 1945, everything changed. we're having lunch, rutabagas and some meat. The ration was 50 grams of meat a week. An army staff car pulls up outside, and I feared that our house would now be requisitioned for American officers with 24-hour notice. How wrong I was. 3 American military government people, one a smiling woman, brought news from my mother living in America. Gathered news from me for her, and then asked the fateful question, would I consider coming to the United States? To a soldier in 1946, that was quite a question. At first, dumbfounded, I answered yes, but then had some inner arguments to go through: opportunity versus loyalty, an unknown new life versus the life I know. But in the end, America won. The big problem was how to implement it, how to communicate with America. No mail service, no telephone, no telegrams, and of course, no email, internet, or any of the modern gadgets. The solution was a special mix of fraternizing and generosity. A nearby army friend of mine hosted informal musical evenings to which an American GI also came. The one of them played violin, the other one cello. The GI listened to my dilemma about the paperwork, volunteered to be my postmaster, and for almost a year handled my mail coming and going. And you know, you can't put an immigration together without moving your papers, and fast. Altogether, it took 16 months from the fateful question to my arrival in America, including several months' delay after a law in Congress forbade immigration of anybody who had ever worn a German uniform. Then my case was admitted. After all, I had refused party membership. I had no rank. I was nowhere listed as a war criminal. I was under 21 and the son of a U.S. citizen. So just before Christmas 1946 came the desired letter from the U.S. consulate in Stuttgart, ordering me to report for transport to the port of Bremerhaven. That Christmas was sad, although I was highly expectant. I took leave with many, many heartfelt hugs. We were 14 days at sea instead of the usual 10. Some 1,200 immigrants, most of them Holocaust survivors, former concentration camp inmates, displaced persons, refugees, expatriates, were packed in 3-decker bedsteads, so low one couldn't pull up one's knees. That's why some of us went down to the empty cargo deck. Seasickness then caught on because the weather got very, very rough. And the stewards threatened quarantine in New York. I was lucky. I was sick one day and then kept myself alive on white bread and black coffee and sheer excitement. A violent storm gripped us for 3 days and nights, twice peeling back our bow, much like a giant sardine can. Arriving in New York Harbor, looking like a wreck, we turned past the Statue of Liberty, while every deck was crowded and not an eye was dry. we were arriving in America. At noon we docked on Pier 44. Within a few hours, 24 stowaways had been arrested and at least one concentration camp commander. Our ship was the SS Marine Perch, 11,450 tons, one of Henry Kaiser's wartime troop ships. She later became a humble bulk carrier and in 1978 sank in the Mediterranean after a blame-free collision. She can be looked up, including the storm picture, on the web. So that evening around 8, my mother and I hugged for the first time after 12 years. What next bowled me over was the plenty of everything, especially food in the stores and cars in the streets. I could hardly believe it. After buying a few clothes, the first thing was to get a U.S. high school diploma. Although I spoke good English for an immigrant, the fine points gave me some trouble. For example, the difference between this week and next week. Almost fouled up a date with my future wife. Or between monks and monkeys, which brought on jolly laughter, and there were others. Only some factory workers on my first factory job badgered me for being a German. At least I wasn't aware of any others. Americans are at heart a generous, fair-minded people. While earning an American high school diploma, I applied to a few colleges. 2 said yes, a small Virginia college, and Harvard. I thought Harvard was unbelievably generous. They got cold feet afterward, saying I should delay my acceptance so that the returning GIs wouldn't be upset because I was an enemy alien. As it turned out, there was no trouble at all. If anything, the opposite. We had good times, lots of camaraderie. The only trouble, guess, after my freshman year was lack of study time and lack of money. But term jobs, 2 great summers as truck driver salesman, loans, and a $50 grant from Harvard enabled me to pay my bills. It would take more than $50 now. And then 2 years later, in February 1949, I met the love of my life, Marjorie. And after 2 more years, in 1950, we began a happy 62-year marriage. I was granted American citizenship. In short, the 2 biggest, happiest events in my life. So in concluding, like I said at the beginning, I've never been sorry I came. America has given me a basis for living as an immigrant, worker, student, husband, friend, father, grandfather, businessman, church member, citizen, and taxpayer. It had also made it possible for me to retain what is precious to me of my German home country, its language, culture, history, and memories of my huge family. I have received much help all along, and the longer I think about it, the more I realize that God, my Heavenly Father, our Heavenly Father, has been there every hour. And so, truly, my heart is filled with gratitude. So I close and say, thank you for listening. Like this. I hope it wasn't too long.